For this project, I decided to do the OSQuery installation on Ubuntu server. I used a graphical user interface to help out a little bit and make it better looking for this video. OSQuery is a really unique tool. What it does is it turns an operating system into a database and allows you to query that database using SQL statements. Um, the DigitalOcean tutorial says that with these queries you can monitor file integrity, check the status and configuration of the firewall, and perform security audits of the target server. It's multi-platform, but we're going to be using it today on Ubuntu. So on the tutorial, there are 6 steps. Steps 5 and 6 allow you to use OSQuery in 2 different ways. We are going to omit step 6 and focus on OQuery I, which uses a command line to test the system based on user input, as opposed to OSQuery D, which sets up an automatic monitoring of this system. So the first step is to install OSQuery on your server. It's pretty straightforward. You're going to need to add a repository and a public key for the repository, because the regular Ubuntu aptitude repository doesn't allow for installing of OSQuery. Once you add those, and then you're just going to use the standard sudo apt-get install OSQuery, and Ubuntu will do the rest. You can go through the tutorial and it shows you a little bit of extra information, but for the sake of brevity, we are going to skip over that and move on to step 2. And for step 2, you need to allow OSQuery to access the system log. And so what you're going to need to do is create a or modify rather the rsyslog.conf file in the etc folder, and then add a small piece of code which they give you, and you can see here in this image. Once you do that, you're going to want to exit the rsyslog file and then restart so that the system can read it. Once you do that, you need to create a configuration file for OSQuery. In the tutorial, they walk you through step by step, showing you exactly what each part of the configuration file does. However, if you go all the way to the end, you can just cut and paste from their complete file. When I did it piece by piece, just cutting and pasting and move it over, it had an error, and the error wasn't entirely clear. So to avoid that, I recommend going to the end of section 3 and cutting and pasting the configuration file over. Then what you're going to do is run a sudo osquery control config check. It says that there will be an output, but when I ran it on my system, there was no output. That bothered me, so I restarted OSQuery using their standard commands, and it got stuck. Wasn't able to reload it and had to completely remove everything that I had installed and start from scratch. So I recommend, once you run that config check, do not worry if there is no output. Once you get to step 4, which is setting up the OSQuery file integrity monitoring pack, what you're going to need to do is create a file in the user folder. They'll give you the working directory for it. It's user share OSQuery packs /fim.conf. And what you're going to do is add some code to it so that OSQuery is able to reference the proper databases and packs. You can again check the config by typing in sudo osquery control config-check, and for me at least, there was no output again. So the interesting part is step 5, using OSQuery I to perform security checks. And so what this does is it allows you to go in and using the command line, perform checks against your system. So what we're going to do here specifically is use a script which will completely wipe out a directory and everything in it if a mistake is made. So the script I wrote, it was actually a piece of malware for my network security class. And if someone using Ubuntu accidentally uses the package manager yum instead of aptitude for an update, it would delete all of their system binaries. Now that's a bit too nefarious for these purposes. I want the computer to still work when it's done. So I modified it to only delete everything in the documents folder. So let's go ahead and start this from the beginning so we can see exactly how OSQuery can show you what goes wrong. So what we're going to do now is run this command here, the select target path, and this will show you every change to the file system. Once you hit enter, you see nothing's happened. So what we're going to go over here and do is move into the documents folder, and we're going to create a couple of directories in documents as well as a couple of simple files for the purposes of this, so we can see exactly how OSQuery handles it. So I'm going to make two directories here, alpha and beta, and then I'll move into each one of them independently and add a couple of files. I'm doing it independently because if I do it all from the documents folder, there will be a lot of temporary files that show up and kind of muddy up the output of OSQuery, and I wanted to avoid that for simplicity's sake, so you can see exactly what's going on here. So in each of these directories, I'm just adding two simple files. I'm not going to add anything to the files, just essentially a name. And then we will, in just a second here, load that script there. You can see that the delta and omega file are there. Now we're back in documents, and now we're home. And so what I'm going to do is show you what we did, and OSQuery shows you all the files we created, exactly what happened is the action, and then the user ID, which is 1000. Now I'm going to open a file called yum in nano in the user bin folder, because if you add a file here, then you can just use that as a command line command essentially. And what the script does is it pretends like you're updating. So if you type in yum, it'll run through everything from the top to sleep 5, and if you type update, it'll run all of the scripts down there at the bottom. You need to change the permissions of the file so that it isn't going to get hung up. I chose 777, so this command essentially has complete control over the system. And here is all the script. Down here at the bottom, this one line right here is what's going to remove everything from documents if they add update to yum. So if they don't add update, if they just for some reason type sudo yum, it would run all the way down here to sleep 5. And now I'm running it, and you can see here, instead of saying sudo apt-get update, it's sudo yum. This shouldn't work, but the script fakes it right here so that the user thinks they're updating, and it looks totally normal. But what it's really doing is not updating. It is deleting everything in the documents folder. And what's interesting is that OSQuery can show us that, because right now we would think nothing's wrong with our system, but if we list everything, you can see that documents is completely gone. It is no longer remaining. And so, that would be a bit concerning if you were a user. And you can go here and see that all the files were deleted. Documents is gone and everything held within that directory. So that's a basic overview of some of the things that OSQuery can do for you. If you go to the documentation on the website for the tool, you can see that there is a lot more. It's exceptionally robust, and I was only able to cover a very small part of what you're able to do with it. But I think that they were really clever with using SQL commands to be able to query your own system for changes. And I highly recommend that you go on the website, see what they can do, and then possibly take this out into the world once you've graduated, and use it, because it's a very, very robust and a good tool for monitoring a system. So thank you very much for watching. Good luck on your finals, and have an excellent day. Cheers.